And Daniel is actually, and his family at their farm is taking what I'm talking about, and they're turning it into action. And that's something that I truly respect and am really, really honored to be a part of. And now Daniel's going to talk a little bit about his experience.
Cool. Thanks so much, Chris. That was awesome and really informative. I for many decades have really loved the biointensive farming techniques, and the first farming book I ever had was John Jevons' How to Grow More Vegetables, and used it like a Bible for years of reference. Back when we just had a small garden and a few cannabis plants tied down with fake flowers all through them. some decades ago, we were really closely following the double digging and the biointensive methods. And over the years, our farm has evolved into about 3/4 of an acre of production vegetables and a small 5,000 square foot cannabis farm. And we've focused a lot on how to integrate these things together. And although we started with our farming on the providing for ourselves on the homestead level, as we become a production market garden, those scales of the 60 30 10 have shifted a little bit, because we grow a lot more lettuce and things like that are really nice for people to get fresh. But one of the things that's amazing here in Humboldt County is that even though we're not growing crops year round, we have this ability to have we have a mild winter, so we can grow a tremendous amount of our carbon for our soil during the winter time here with cover cropping. And a big part of our focus of the last few years is how to effectively cover crop in our different farming systems, and how to effectively bring that cover crop material, all that carbon that's created through winter photosynthesis, back into the soil. And with a big focus for us on no-till farming. So how can we do this with the minimum soil disturbance possible? How can we leave the natural balance that nature provides in the complexity of soil life as much intact as possible? I'd like to, I'm going to do a screen share. I have a really brief slideshow, but I'm going to go through it slowly and talk about what's going on in each of these slides with folks as we do it. So bear with me for a second as I get this up and going. Here. There we go. Okay, so this slide is our food farm kind of in the background, and compost piles. We make about 40 yards of on-farm compost a year out of goat manure, crop debris, some local hay. And in the picture, we are converting cover cropped cannabis beds to be able to plant them. So mowing down cover crops, spreading compost on top, and these days we actually don't mow it. We crimp the cover crops. So this is from a couple of years ago. And then in between the cannabis beds, we have spring crops of food going. And one of the neat things about working with cannabis in a farming system, or hemp for that matter, is it's a crop that's in the ground for a really long time and starts very small and ends the season as big as you want it to be, but on our farm a 12-foot by 10-foot wide crop. So you have all this space and soil available to you on the farm throughout the first part of the year to be able to grow food crops. For us, we grow multiple rotations of spring crops, lettuce, arugula, radishes, things like that, and get an early marketable crop in the spring into summer. And then have those beds as the cannabis starts to shade them out, go into a summer cover crop of buckwheat that can be mowed down or cut and used as a mulch on the cannabis beds for a little extra fertility going into flower time. Talking about whole food, what we eat in the closed loops. One of the things we do is when we leaf cannabis or prune, we feed it to our goats, and our goats are a big part of our food supply. We get milk, we make cheese, we get meat, and the goats also provide us with a lot of fire safety security around our farm. So it's a really good relationship for a farm to have farm animals to provide fertility and to be able to use some of the excess crop to make food for us. Here's the cannabis getting planted in that garden. With every other bed, a food crop and cannabis in between. One of the things we also do occasionally is plant food crops in between the cannabis on the cannabis rows. Although this season, what we're doing is with those full-term cannabis plants that start out 10 feet apart from each other and end up touching by the end of the season, is planting autoflower so that in the same square footage that we have for our license, we can get a mid-season crop out of the same space, and then that's removed in time for the full term to grow up and fill in that space. And so this is a lettuce bed, cannabis bed, and a bed of cutting greens. I believe arugula behind it. On our main food farm that we do for market, we use a no to low till system. We use a broad fork to aerate the soil, but we don't mix the layers, and we do a lot of cover cropping and high carbon on the surface, mimicking the natural process where the soil isn't flipped and there would be duff, crop debris, tree leaves, grass, things like that on the soil surface, and earthworms will come up and bring it down. So instead of relying on tilling or flipping beds to integrate the nutrients, the biomass into the soil, we're relying on the biology to do that. As I was talking about cover crop, for building biomass, for being that carbon crop of giving back to the soil, this is a cover crop mix we plant often. Cayuse oats is the cereal grain that grows up fast in the fall and grabs a lot of the nutrients before the winter rains can wash them out here. And then a number of different leguminous crops that can both grow up and use the oat as a trellis sort of, but also fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and provide nitrogen for the following season's fertility. Just some more farm shots. We're farming on what would generally be considered marginal land. It's flat, but not perfectly flat. It's surrounded by forest, not really in the bottomlands. But we started out with some pretty decent soil, and we've continued to build the soil up year by year by adding as much organic material as possible. And one of the goals for us has been to transition from traditional tilling or turning of soil encourages a bacterially dominant soil. Bacterially dominant soil, it provides a lot of nutrients but breaks them down quickly, so they are available for a short time. When you transition a soil to a fungal dominant soil, and that you do by adding a lot of organic matter onto the surface, by mulching, composting, and by not disturbing the soil profile, mushrooms in general have the ability to break down higher carbon material in slower and into a more stable organic matter. So for sequestering carbon without adding a lot of nitrogen from off farm, creating fungal dominant soil is ideal, and especially with cannabis and hemp. There have been a number of studies that show that cannabis highly prefers a fungally dominant soil and produces more abundant terpenes, more abundant cannabinoids with a higher fungal balance. There's kind of an overview of one of our main cannabis planting areas with the cannabis mulched in the spring and food crops planted in between. The greenhouse is our starts nursery for the farm. Crops of yarrow. So in addition, we really work for our IPM program at always having flowering plants available and stacking functions. A lot of this is about growing your own medicine too. And one of the neat things about growing medicine is oftentimes the crops that provide really good herbal medicine also provide flowers for beneficial insects, and also provide beauty for your farm, and can also provide fertility. This yarrow here, one of the things we do with it is cut it and ferment it to make an FPJ, a fermented plant juice that can be used to fertilize the cannabis during the mid-season. And we do that with a lot of the crops that are abundant. We'll cut them and make a tea with them to feed back to the garden. The yarrow especially is a great crop for beneficial insects. Any of these umbel flowers with the umbel like umbrella, these small domed flowers, are an especially good habitat for beneficial insects. Beneficial insects being predators that are able to predate on aphids, on thrips, on other cannabis pests, are often insects that in their adult stage eat nectar and pollen from flowers. And so if you have the flowers, they're hanging out there in their ideal habitat, well fed, and then they lay their larvae on the pest. So there's a number of predatory wasps, syrphid flies, ladybugs, various insects like that given the right environment will make a home in your farm, and then then predate on your cannabis pests. So here we have a stacking of functions. Between the cannabis plants, we have a crop of lettuce coming up, and then in the background was a crop of arugula that was allowed to go to seed to provide a habitat for beneficial insects right there in the cannabis garden, and then also to provide seed that we can collect to plant our crop the next year. And then this is a crop of cilantro between the cannabis plants. And so that planted around now, I believe in early April, was a crop that we were able to harvest multiple times and have it regrow, bring the cilantro to market and freeze a lot of it for ourselves for the winter time, and then let it go to seed. And cilantro is an especially amazing forage crop for beneficial insects and for bees and native pollinators. I had at one time gone out to check on the cilantro and discovered, I believe, 12 different species of insects on a 1 foot by 1 foot square area eating pollen and nectar from the cilantro. And there's a bumblebee in the foreground on Tithonia. That orange flower is Tithonia, or Mexican sunflower. And then talking about the diversity of planting for income. For us, we plant our food crops for ourselves, but also as an alternative income stream apart from our cannabis. We feel part of our giving back to our community is providing food, and it also brings in a little bit of income throughout the year to help us keep going. I know one of the challenges with cannabis is that the income comes in big blocks and with a long time in between. So it's nice as a veggie farmer to be able to have income continuously coming in every week throughout the season as we do farmers markets or CSAs or restaurant sales. Here's a picture of making some on-farm compost. And we're back around. So I'm gonna stop this screen share and go back to this. You know, I don't have too much else prepared. I would love to open it up and to see if anybody has questions for myself or Chris about what we're talking about, or things they'd like to know more about. Feel free to chat it up and ask us anything you want.
Daniel had a question. What percentage of your farm goes to family food for market and compost?
Well, I'd say it's hard to tease apart. We just eat out of the farm kind of as much as we want. We have two other folks who are interns living here on the farm who also get as much food as they want from the farm. We do about 25 to 30 CSA shares and 2 farmers markets, as well as a few restaurant contracts. And as far as the compost, we do bring quite a bit off farm for our compost. We use goat manure, but we buy organic local alfalfa to feed the goats. And then we also buy local grass hay, about 100 bales of hay a year to mix with the goat manure and add to the compost, and also get some local organic dairy cow manure. Part of it for us is the trying to run a market farm as a business. We really are trying to maximize all of our space that we can grow on. So if we were doing this as a just to feed our family, I think we would grow about half as much space as we do and keep the other half in growing compost and forage crops.
I've got a couple questions that I can ask to you.
Okay.
Allison asks, I'm curious, what do you think the role of distributors like Flowcana are and can be in promoting this approach to mixed food cannabis farming?
Well, Flowcana was a big supporter of the CSA model. Last year, when Flowcana was operating the Whitethorn production facility, we provided 100% off of our farm CSA shares for all of the folks working there at Whitethorn. And then I know Flowcana also provides CSA to all of their employees through the Mendocino Food Hub, which supports small, sometimes cannabis and sometimes just food farms, diversified farms in Mendocino County. In addition, Flowcana helped to spearhead the start of a project, which is now an independent project, Sun and Earth certified, that came out of a collaboration between Flowcana, Dr. Bronner's, and the Brother David's brand, and is now an independent inspection-based certification program certifying regeneratively grown cannabis. And part of that certification is having forage crops for beneficial insects, having a diversified production. It doesn't require that you grow food for market, but it does require that you do grow some other crops besides cannabis for your farm.
Aaron Larson has a question. Where do you start with garden design?
What do you want to eat? I think that's the biggest place to start. What do you want to eat and how much space do you have? If you have a container garden and you love pesto, and it's just your windowsill in your apartment, plant some basil. If you love fresh salads, and you've got a light depth farm, plant one of those beds in lettuce for the winter for you to eat. There's all kinds of things that are available, and the biggest thing is what provides you joy will be what you put the energy into. Um, so as far as design, there's a lot of resources, there's a lot available, folks you can talk to, but yeah, start with what makes you hungry when you think about it.
Perfect. Um, can Steve Lowe asks, can you explain the FPJ in more detail? How do you make it? What plants do you use? How is it applied to the garden?
Well, we don't follow a specific traditional FPJ, like we're not practitioners in Korean natural farming, but what we've been doing lately, which has evolved over the years, is pretty much any plant. I do it. I love doing it with stinging nettles, with comfrey, with those traditional plants you do it with. But when I mow my lawn in the spring and there's an area with a bunch of clover and fresh grass, I'll take that. And what I do is by weight, I add about a quarter of the weight of the plant mass in sugar. And primarily that is to activate the bacteria, and also to provide like an osmotic drawing out of the juices from the plant, similar to if you've ever made sauerkraut or ferments, you add salt to it, and that draws the moisture out of the cabbage. So you mix your plant material, you chop it up real fine. I do that on a chopping block with a machete. You could do it, you could tear it up by hand. I'll put it in a 5-gallon bucket, tossed with the sugar, with a weight on top of it. It will pull the vital juices out of the plant, and you'll have a brine of sorts that is the juices pulled out of the cells of the plants. You can also add a little bit of water if you want. We often add whey because we make cheese a lot with our goat milk, and that kind of jump starts the bacterial process. But there are bacteria there, and it'll do its thing naturally. After a few weeks, we strain the liquids off of the solids of those fermented plant juices. A 5-gallon bucket full of plant solids will make about 1 gallon to 1.5 gallons of a thick viscous liquid. And we add that to foliar sprays at about 1 to 500. So 1 part FPJ to 500 parts water. So pretty dilute, and we'll spray that on plants about once a week, especially in the early stages in the nursery when they're in pots and don't have access to as much soil and minerals and whatnot.
Okay, Russell Pace has a question. Do you use dynamic accumulators as fertilizer? It appears that plants like nettle, yarrow, and comfrey make excellent fertilizers, but the amount of space you need to grow enough plants to support your fertilization seems to be 2 to 1. What are your thoughts? Speaking specifically to create a dry powdered amendment as fertilizer, not FPJ.
So we've never done a dried powdered amendment for our plants with dynamic accumulators. Like you'd said, I believe it would be something like a 2 to 1 ratio to be able to provide that. And in the end, it very much feels like you just would be mining one area to provide for another, because they are pulling minerals and nutrients out of the soil and making them bioavailable, but it is still pulling it out of the soil. Our approach has been just with an FA and just as a supplement for the garden, whereas compost, which comes from our animals, which are feeding over a larger area, wood chips, and wood for which we put in our hugel beds and things like that are more where we bring the mass of our nutrients in. One of our focuses with the dynamic accumulators, such as comfrey and nettle and yarrow, has been as a supplement, but then also thoughtful placement. Our land isn't exactly flat, and we know where the drainages are on our land. So where the nutrient flow would be, and where the spots where water leaves our cultivated areas and leaves our gardens, either through groundwater or on the surface. And we've built beds with hugelkultur techniques, putting wood in those beds and building up lush beds in those areas. The wood as a sponge to kind of catch some of that water flow and catch some of those nutrients, especially the first flushes in the fall, and then having dynamic accumulators there that we can use to catch any nutrients that would be leaving our farm into the system, cut those dynamic accumulators, bring them back up to the top of the system in the form of compost to put back in the soil. And in that way, it's for us very much like the last net to make sure that nutrients that will be a big benefit to us on our farm don't leave our farm to be a detriment in the water ecology system downstream.
I love that. That's great. M asks, do you have an opinion on hugelkultur raised beds?
Yeah, I love them, especially for cannabis. We don't do all of our cannabis with hugelkultur. We've on our farm reserved hugelkultur for areas that had more marginal soil and needed to be built up. So we absolutely love them for cannabis. We feel like it grows incredible cannabis, and for a home gardener trying to grow food for yourself rather than a market garden approach, it can be a really good source of cannabis and food. Like on our hugelkulturs, we plant cannabis, and then there's a number of perennial food crops that are interplanted in the same beds with the cannabis, such as artichokes and squash and pumpkins growing underneath, and flowers and other crops. And we also used our hugelkultur beds as a place away from our main market garden to grow seed crops that won't have as much cross pollination with some of the farm crops. If you're what we've found for ourselves, if we're growing for production for market gardening, we don't prefer hugelkulturs because they're a little harder to work with, to plant, to weed, to harvest. So for efficiency for market farming, we prefer just a no-till, straight 30-inch beds in zones. But the cannabis responds really well to the hugelkultur, and then we've shifted to managing some of our non-hugelkultur beds that we grow cannabis in to a similar style. We used to shift our cannabis back and forth with other beds, and we discovered that cannabis, unlike a lot of crops, if you can deal with the pest pressure, then cannabis likes growing in the same spot it grew as well with that. So some of our non-hugelkultur beds, we've started going in like a lasagna gardening sort of a way, where we just layer on top. It's heavily mulched, and then instead of pulling the mulch off to plant cover crop, we put compost on top of the mulch and put our cover crop seeds into that compost or manure, grow a cover crop. We use crimping to break that cover crop down just to get it flat without tearing it up, so that it breaks down slowly and provides an environment, and then just layer more compost and more mulch on top of it, so that we're constantly building up and never breaking into that balanced soil layer.
So we're coming up on 12 o'clock. I think we can go until about 12:15. And we have 4 more questions that have come in. And Nathan Volkers asks, do you have any authors or literature that you can recommend about biointensive farming?
Chris, you want to?
Sure. Yeah, there's, I definitely like Daniel mentioned, the Bible is by John Jevon, How to Grow More Vegetables, which is probably in its like 40th edition somewhere, who knows, but that really is going to be like one of the main building blocks of this system. You know, I would always recommend the permaculture manual, Bill Mollison's permaculture manual, as kind of yet another staple or Bible. And I would check into a few books like, you know, like Masanobu Fukuoka, like One Straw Revolution, like take some of these older kind of, you know, some of the older literature and principles and kind of start there, to really assess the old principles of what we're building. We keep building on as we develop these different types of systems. But as far as like getting into it, I think, yeah, how to grow more vegetables is kind of is your basic book. I would definitely get some sort of a handbook as far as like in organic gardening, pests and insects. I think there's one, Pests of the Garden and Small Farm, which is a really good book. And then a couple other books to get more in depth are from, I think, it's Jeff Lowenfeld, right? How to Teaming with Microbes and Teaming with Nutrients are a few really interesting books. And whatever region you're into, I know that there's a lot of gardening books that are kind of based on biointensive gardening, but they're adapted to your local zone or climate, and you can find those pretty much anywhere. Like, for example, like in the zones of Northern California, there was a really great book called Golden Gate Gardening, which just was like kind of a step-by-step guide of what to plant in these zones that are like a little bit more of a coastal cool, that are a little bit trickier to plant in, but they'll give you like suggestions on how to plant and what to plant and when, which, you know, and then to successively plant or interplanting and companion planting, which is really helpful. And that's one of the great things about How to Grow More Vegetables, though, is he kind of covers everything from plant spacing to how to replenish the soil to like what plants go well with one another. It's kind of just a tell-all of how to do it the bio-intensive way, and I recommend it.
And Chris, would you do us a favor and kind of write up your bit of your bibliography and post it in the webinar chat while we
Absolutely.
go through another couple questions?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Allison asks, what is your history with autoflowers? Are they a recent addition to your production system?
No history at all. We're just playing around with it right now. I had started some last year with the intention of doing it and got busy. So I just planted some seeds of the Magic Melon autoflower from Humboldt Seed Company just this morning, put them in the ground, and we're experimenting. It's part of the fun of farming for us, is trying something new all the time.
Stephen Luther asks, could these methods be scaled up to a medium-sized farm with an acre of row cropped cannabis cultivation?
Absolutely. I think that it would take some experimentation with a medium-sized farm of an acre of cannabis. A big part of it is how you deal with your efficiencies, and a big part of farming is efficiency. But I think it is very doable. That's been a big part of our focus with the food farming, is efficiency, and integrating that with cannabis, I think works great. And any of these methods are scalable. It's just figuring out the nuts and bolts of how that scale works for you.
Awesome. For the attendees, if you have any remaining questions, if you can add them into the question and answer or in the chat panel, that would be awesome. And with that, Morgan has a question. How long does it take for the ideal hugelkultur mound to become productive?
What I've heard is 3 years is ideal, but we've had great success with productivity on the first year with hugelkultur, and I think part of that is designing it with that in mind. So we started our hugelkultur mounds with about half and half fresh wood and well decomposed wood from the forest that already had mycelium and fungal growth on it. And then we made sure to add lots of little wood and added in manure and compost with the wood layer so that it wouldn't steal too much of the nutrients in the early decomposition of the wood. But last year we finished a group of hugels in June, planted them out immediately, and had a really good successful run with them.
Awesome. Aaron Larson says, we've been concerned about monoculture in our cannabis farms. Sounds like they might actually like it, as long as there's variety and companion planting.
Yes and no. I mean, there's a difference between planting in the same space and monoculture. But yeah, if there's companion planting, if there is diversity in the soil. So, you know, I would say that they like to grow in the same spot when done correctly. And to me, that's returning all of the carbon. So chipping the cannabis up, putting the chips back on the bed. It's making sure there are other plants in that same bed, in that same soil. So there's companion plants, flowers, all of that, not just in a separate area, but sharing some of that root zone. You know, and most of the thoughts I have about that are anecdotal. I believe cannabis creates fungal relationships. So if you're rototilling, that kind of would negate some of those benefits of cannabis growing back in the same spot, that it's not developing those fungal relationships that stay on the roots. One of the things that I think is beneficial, I mean, obviously, if there's any disease pressure or viral pathology or anything like that, it negates some of these things. But what we try to do is cut our cannabis and leave the stalks and the roots in place to decompose over the winter, and they'll be there enough the next season that you have to plant, you know, 6 inches to the side. But then all of those fungal relationships that built up with that cannabis is right there for the plant the next season. But I think on overall farm level, if you were to look at your farm from the top and you see 95% of the canopy being cannabis, it's not providing the environmental diversity that helps the whole ecosystem as well. But yeah, the concept, like the idea of that really came, it stems from observing the way cannabis has evolved. You know, you see cannabis, hemp as a ditchweed in the Midwest, and it seeds out millions of seeds, drops them right in the place. Some get carried off, but most of them sprout and grow back in that same place the next year. And you see really vibrant, healthy stands of feral cannabis, and it's growing year after year after year in its own footsteps. So that's where that anecdotal concept comes from.
Awesome. Awesome. Daniel or Chris, do you have any closing comments that you'd like to wrap up with?
Well, I really appreciate being here. And I guess one thing, yeah, just to close with is like the question of, you know, what should I plant? It's just one of those things where, like Daniel said, is like, just plant what you want, plant what you can. You know, this type of farming that we're talking about is something that can be as accessible as to you as you want it to be. Like anybody can plant and grow a garden, no matter how much space that they have, whether it's a container garden or a half acre or 5 acres. But this is just one way for us to like create and regain that connection that we have to like the land and our food security and our local food source, as well as to others around us. You know, so being able to do this really just helps to foster that connection, and it's a way to really perpetuate our own sustainability and how we see ourselves kind of in the world and how we interact. And you know, in relation to being able to sustain ourselves and our families, you know, I believe that where the world is heading is, you know, we're all going to have to know how to plant this way, or plant food and grow food for ourselves, and do it in a way that is giving back to the community and to the earth. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I would say similarly. One of the exciting things for me about being part of the cannabis industry is where we are a new industry, and we have this opportunity to create our part in this industry in a different pattern. Our industrial culture and industrial agriculture specifically has really failed us all. It's destroying the planet. It's mining the topsoil. It's doing everything wrong, including making us unhealthy because of the lack of true nutrition in the food that's provided. So as cultivators of cannabis, we can choose to cultivate in a way that fundamentally changes that relationship with nature and that relationship with medicine, and and takes back from, we've kind of contracted out our lives and our food to large industrial agriculture, and they are not worthy of that responsibility. So as we take that responsibility back in growing our medicine, growing our cannabis, and growing our food, we take back our own individual power to define ourselves as separate from an extractive culture, and as part of a culture that gives back, and that is sustainable in the long run for us, for our health, for our community, and for our ecosystem. And it's a really exciting time to be part of this. And I'd love to continue the discussion. If anybody has more questions, you can always contact me through our website, brycelandforestfarm.com, through our Instagram, which is Bryceland Forest Farm, or any other way you can find. I really love talking about it and love sharing this stuff with folks. So.
Well, we love having you here. This is wonderful. And Jesse Dodd has a question, which is, what lessons can farms learn from the current COVID situation? Tie that back in with what you were just saying.
Yeah, basically, Jesse, love hearing your voice, even translated through Natalie. I think the biggest lesson is that it's a house of cards. We've built an unsustainable system, and all it takes is one break in a very delicate chain to make our supply chain not work for us, and that to be truly self-sustaining as individuals and as community, we have to really look at what our needs are, whether whether that means buying a bidet so you don't need to rely on toilet paper, or growing some food yourself. So when there is a time when there's a break in the supply of food, you can provide for yourself, because this is one situation, but here on the North Coast, we're aware of all of these potential situations, whether it be large earthquakes, other natural disasters, or fires. And our system really isn't well equipped to deal with multiple natural disasters at the same time. So if there were hurricanes on the East Coast at the same time there's an earthquake and fire here, we wouldn't really have the resources we need for quite a while to deal with it. And think about what resources, what you need to live, and what you need to support the vulnerable people in your community and your community as a whole, and then take whatever baby steps it is towards doing that. Everything helps. Support local farmers, sign up for a CSA, plant some basil in a flower box on your deck. It's all reconnecting with our basic needs, and I think that's where we start to build the foundation back up for a sustainable culture.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I'm in the process of building out a garden in my own backyard, and I feel more inspired to go start digging today after this talk. I want to thank everybody that has logged in today. I will send out this recording as well as I'm going to get bibliography information from Daniel and Chris to share with everybody for best books on hugelkultur and growing more vegetables. So we'll send that out to everybody that registered for this event. We'll post this this recording on our website probably by the beginning of next week after all of these have been recorded. And I do want to remind people that tomorrow we have viruses, viroids, and pathology. This is going to be a deep dive into plant pathology, talking about bacteria, fungal pathogens, viruses, and viroids, learning what the difference is and why should cannabis farmers be informed. Attendees will learn how to test for different pathogens, the importance of quarantine of new plants, and the benefits of protecting your crop. Sounds kind of like what we're doing as humans right now. And this is all presented by Annalisa Fabritas, PhD from A&L Crop Solutions, and moderated by Joanna Berg of Dirty Business Soil. So that's tomorrow at 11. If you have not already registered, do so at HCGA's website. And make sure to tune in today for our 420 celebration at 4 o'clock. Thank you, everyone.